So we talked about using ABC analysis to segment SKUs or products. Now we're going to talk about segmenting supply chains. And I'm going to talk about two papers. And the first paper was by Marshall Fisher, published in the late 90s in the Harvard Business Review. And he said, at the heart of it, if you break down all the products you have, they fall into one of two camps. They're either functional, like cans of soup, or they're innovative, like this is a smartphone. And you can think of the different characteristics of these two classic types of products differently. So the demand for these functional products are pretty predictable. We've been selling soup for 100 years. It's pretty stable. The life cycle is 2 years or longer. You don't introduce that many new things. The margin is okay, 5 to 20%. Variety's not tremendous. Error production is pretty low. Stock out rates relatively low because you got predictable demand. Not going to mark down too much. And so the lead time for make to order is about 6 months to a year. So what you focus on here, the objective then is to be efficient. You want to be very efficient in delivering functional items through your supply chain. Opposed to this are these innovative items. These are ones where the demand is very unpredictable. It's a very short life cycle. Think fashion items. And cell phones and smartphones are becoming fashion items. Very short life cycle. The margin is much higher, 20 to 60%. A very, very high variety. Look at the number of different smartphones that are out there. Error production can be quite high, pretty high stock out rates, and you have a big forced markdown. If you're selling a style from last season, you're going to have to mark it down pretty tremendously. And the lead time is very quick for make to order. And so for these innovative products, you might want to have a different objective for your supply chain. And the idea is to match supply and demand. You might be willing to do something that costs a lot to make sure you have your demand covered. While over here for functional items, you want to be very efficient. So the key takeaway from this paper is that maybe you want to think about your products in terms of how you want to have your supply chain deliver them. If they're functional, right, you might want to focus in on being more efficient and cost effective. Over here on the innovative, cost, sure, it's always something you want to consider, but the big thing is to make sure you don't miss any demand because there's a big penalty if you miss that. So this is a classic paper, and it's a nice way to think about supply chains of having two very different objectives, cost efficient or matching supply and demand. Now, a paper by Olafson, Lee, and Denisi took it a step further, and they focused in on cases that they'd been working on with Hewlett-Packard and printers. And so what they did is they said, okay, let's look at the different functions or activities that you might have to make a decision on. And the ones they focused on were location of manufacturing, the shipping internationally. How do I move things between borders? Where do I assemble the product? How do I fulfill? Where do I fulfill that from? And what model do I use for determining how to stock the inventory? And for each of these 5 functions, I can have a fast or a high cost solution for that. I can have an intermediate or a slow or low cost. So Marshall Fisher's paper was focusing in on this fast, high cost. That's the innovative products, and the functional products would maybe go only slow or low. But they said, it's not an all or nothing. So maybe you want to think about it in a little more finer grained. And so what they did, just filling this out, is you can look at maybe your manufacturing location is onshore. That means it's in the EU, the European Union, or the US. This is kind of focused on a United States and a Europe market, down to a near shore where it's close, and for the US it's in Mexico, and maybe it's in Eastern Europe for the EU, or offshore, and this could be in the Pacific Rim or somewhere else, further away. And so for manufacturing location, these are the options from a very high cost to a low cost solution. International shipping, you can think of the same way. I can move it by air, or at the other extreme, I can move it by boat. And that's the slowest and lowest cost. Final assembly, I can assemble onshore, near shore again, or way offshore, just following the same thing as the manufacturing location. Same thing with fulfillment. Do I fulfill on, near, or offshore? And then the question, how do I stock? Do I build to stock? Do I configure to order, or do I build to order? Now, we've talked about build or make to order and build or make to stock, but what do I mean by configure to order? Well, that's almost like the sandwich shop where I have a sandwich that's already made, but I do a little bit different to it. I put it on different type of bread. So if you think of electronics, a lot of it is that final configuration. So most of the product is put together. It's like a last-minute postponement. So let's look at some examples. In the early 1990s, late 1980s, the original inkjet followed this type of supply chain. They were manufacturing in the market onshore. They would rail and truck it, right, product, and they would assemble it onshore. They'd fulfill from onshore, and they were building to stock. So if you were in Europe, right, they were building ones with French, German, and Spanish writing and conditions in each. And as you would expect, you would end up with too much of one country's product and too little of another's. So there's a challenge here because yes, it was very fast, it was close, but they were running into problems in that they'd be the different languages and different power unit needs were having a problem. They were having too much of one and too little of another. So what they did is, this is a classic paper by Hao Li, is that they used postponement, and so they shifted and they said, instead of manufacturing near shore, let's manufacture it where there's a low cost, and then I'm going to ship things by ocean, and so I'll have the final assembly on shore and the fulfillment there. But what I'm going to do different is this configured order. So I'm going to make what's known as vanilla printers over here. They're going to be the basic printers that don't change. And then over here, my configuration, this is where I add the language component, maybe the different power cord, maybe if it's a laptop, what they would typically do is add the different keyboard. So anything that's configured to the local market needs, whether it's selling this in France or Germany or Spain, whatever is different, I configure that in the market. So this whole idea of postponement, modularizing the base product and customizing, mass customization at the end, is a classic example. Interestingly though, it didn't stay this way. They don't still service it this way. They've shifted over the last several years to this model where they still produce in a low-cost manufacturing environment. They ship by ocean. Final assembly though now is offshore. And so they found that there's a lower cost here, and what's really driven this is that the product itself, think about the late 1980s, early 1990s, the market for home printers was new. And so you had a lot of volatility of things. And what's happened over the last 10, 20, 30 years? Well, it's gotten very mature. So the number of SKUs are starting to shrink, right? The life's going a little longer, so they're shifting to be more functional-like rather than innovative. The home printers aren't really an innovative space anymore. So they shifted to more of a low-cost solution for manufacturing and movement, and they've moved to this stocking solutions at this faster or higher cost method. So this is just a simple example, but it illustrates a couple things. One is the segmentation is more nuanced than just one or the other. It impacts how I do these very different tasks or different functions. Also, it shows that supply chains evolve over time. You know, as the products change, as the customers change, the way you service them, your supply chain will evolve. So there's no single best practice that lasts forever. Things change, and as those things change, your supply chain needs to adjust.